Well, good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. First, I'd like to make a couple of administrative announcements. So for those of you that have not been to this room before, if there's an emergency, we'll exit out the back there or this exit door here. We'll just convene out to my left, your right. Restrooms are directly out in the hallway, and there's a restrooms downstairs for us to use. We will be doing a closed door session, and so the board will exit, and we're going to go upstairs to the State Threat Assessment Center, where there's a conference room there that we'll be using. And if you see any of the members using electronic devices, it's normally because they're looking at their materials electronically, although we have printed packets as well. So I'd like to go ahead and start us off and take a roll for us. Sitting in for the chair is myself, Mitch Medigovich, on behalf of Pat Mallon for the board. And then Chief Howland.
Here.
Charles Bernan.
Here.
Charles Cullen.
Here.
Paul Truxell.
Here.
Sheriff Maley. Let's see him. Sheriff Honey. Corey. Mike Miller. Here. Chris Heron.
Here.
Chief Peters.
Here.
And Chief Carter.
Here.
Excellent. And we have a quorum for today's session. And before we move further, I just wanted to say this will be Paul Truxell's last 911 board with us. We are fortunate to have Paul has accepted a position with Cal OES. So we're excited to have that happen. So he will, while he won't be sitting on the board, he will definitely be part of the 911 community and helping us out within the 911 branch. And so thank you for all of your efforts here on the board, and welcome aboard. So, all right, this meeting is officially called to order. The first agenda item for us is our minutes, and so I need approval from our last set of minutes there. Do we have a motion as such?
Chris Heron. Oh, sorry. I'll second your motion then.
Okay, we have a first and a second, so we're for that. All those in favor say aye.
Mitch,
Yes?
one correction.
Sure.
Shows me being at the meeting in December, and I was not at the meeting.
Oh, thank you. And so noted. We will make that
was ill.
correction accordingly.
Can we have a new motion for the minutes as
Absolutely.
revised?
So a new motion to, with the minutes as revised.
So moved.
I'll still second.
Great. I seeing no dissent, then that moves forward. Okay, at this point in time, I'd like to, we're going to break and go into a closed session. So for those members that are here have joined us, thank you. If you'll give us a few minutes, we're going to be in closed session, and then we'll rejoin as soon as we've finished. Thank you. Okay, we'll reconvene into public session. So there was no action other than what was taken in the on the agenda. That was focused on outage reporting. So that was the primary focus of the closed session period. We'll now move into item 4, which is emergency alert and warning systems. And we're very fortunate to have Sheriff Martin here with us today, and an opportunity to present to us from Lake about their use and an opportunity to tell us how their experiences between all things. So if you please join us up front. Thank you.
Thank you. I got to tell you, I'll start off by saying I feel a little bit funny talking about best practices because I don't know if these are the best practices. These are just what we found work for us. So I want to talk about what our experiences were and where we've come from since 2015 when we had our first set of serious fires and dealing with those from the perspective of a very small rural county within the state that consistently has the distinction of being the least economically advantaged state. I've been told don't call our county poor because that's not a nice thing to say, but we're consistently at the bottom of the rankings as far as economic advantage. We have a very rural population. In 2015, I had just taken office as a brand new sheriff, and we had our first serious fire of the year, which was the Rocky Fire. That fire was described at the time as unprecedented. It burned in a very rural area with some small pockets of populated areas, but really didn't have a lot of impact on any of our largely populated areas. We had to conduct some evacuations. The fire burned very quickly. The fire modeling maps showed that the area that it was projected to burn through would burn in a matter of 4 or 5 days, and it burned through in about 7.5 hours. Fortunately, we had no loss of life during that incident, and just a few homes lost. Before that fire was fully contained, we had another fire start. That was the Jerusalem fire. It started in a different area of the county, but it ended up burning into the burn scar area of the Rocky Fire. We had no loss of life, but again, several homes were lost during that fire. And then, of course, the biggest fire we had of that year was in 2015, which was the Valley Fire, which at the time would go to become the third most devastating wildfire in California's history. I think we've been surpassed by that distinction in the last couple of years, but at the time, it was another unprecedented fire. Dealing with those, we always had the idea that something like this will never happen in our community. I think a lot of us think that those types of things happen elsewhere. That'll never happen here. Our response and preparation, our emergency alert and warning systems consisted at the time of a reverse 911 system that had a dozen landlines available, so we could send out a recorded message, 12 phone calls at a time. And you can imagine at the height of the Valley Fire, we had 20,000 people evacuated, and trying to call them 12 people at a time was extremely difficult and didn't work out that well for us. The other thing we had was Nixle, which was a free service, kind of works like Twitter. I'm sure a lot of people are aware of what Nixle is. But again, that was a service that only worked if people were actually subscribed to it. So we've come a long way from there. We've come to learn that it's best to have redundancy built into these systems, and I'm sure I'm here telling people a lot of what they already know, but have redundancy. And we've also found that if you have the least amount of platforms to access that redundancy, it's probably better. We've since implemented iPause. We have wireless emergency alerts. We've switched our reverse 911 platform to a system that's internet-based, so we can reach out and contact more people simultaneously than with the traditional landlines. We've implemented public radio. We've reached out to our ham radio operator groups. We reach people by way of Nixle, continue to reach them by way of Nixle, by email, and we've also implemented Sirens in some of our communities. Another platform that we've implemented is the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration weather radio systems, where we distributed by way of a grant through Farmers Insurance, or State Farm Insurance, $10,000 worth of weather radios to people in our community. Some advice that I would have to this group is, first of all, know what your community is. Whether you're serving a city or a large county, you're going to have different needs. Our needs in Lake County are much different than the needs of those in our urban counterparts. For instance, I've been asked, what do you do in the event of a large-scale riot or demonstration such as is going on in Sacramento? And my answer is, we arrest both of them. So it's a little bit different than what you're dealing in the bigger areas. When you know what those events might be in your area, for example, I will never have to worry about a tsunami. I will never have to worry about a train wreck. I will never have to worry about a nuclear power plant meltdown, because those things are nowhere near me and they do not affect my community. But we do have plans available for the events that we are sure to face in the future. Active shooters in our schools, active shooters in our communities, more fire events, more flood events. We have contingencies available where we have pre-planned messaging for these types of events. We know if there's going to be a flood that we have some time to think about it. We know that we can take some time to notify our people that are in danger areas. And those types of events are certainly different than the no-notice events, where there's a wildland fire that spreads at a rate that's measured in miles per hour, where homes are devastated and people are caught off guard. So being prepared is key. Have pre-planned messages. And another key is to have designated, pre-identified personnel available. A lot of times, particularly in smaller agencies, there's this feeling that, well, we're only going to have a couple people with the authority to make these decisions. I'm going to tell you that's a mistake. You need to designate several people within your agency, people that are awake and at work while you're home sleeping, that have the ability, that have the training, that have the authority to make those decisions. I instruct those people in my agency, if there's a question as to whether or not you evacuate, evacuate. Don't second guess it. I would much rather err on the side of being wrong and causing somebody to leave their home and being awakened unnecessarily than holding off on that decision and having something tragic happen. If your population contains people of different languages, ensure that your messaging is available in the languages that best reach them. If your population, and it does, has people with access and function needs, make sure that you have methods of notifying them. I mentioned Sirens a little bit earlier. One of the questions that comes up with Sirens is, why were Sirens taken down? From what I can tell, historically, they were taken down because people got tired of hearing them. They got desensitized to them. But now there's this push because when the fires came through Lake County, we lost landlines very quickly. I know in Mendocino County during the fires of these most recent fires in the Redwood Complex, an entire city of Willits lost all communication. Their radio communication center went down, their cell towers went down, their landline communications went down, and the only thing that was left was the public radios that were able to reach people. People will never not be able to go out and turn on their car unless their car is caught in a disaster, but that is one method of communication that's available for everybody. With the hearing impaired community, we purchased a certain portion of those were equipped with light operated features that flashed a bright light for the people that had the weather radios. One thing that's important is to also recognize the limitations that each one of these systems has. There are areas in your jurisdiction where wireless service, you can't always hear me now. It just doesn't always reach everywhere. And in our community, there's a vast majority of our community where wireless service does not work. Know that in the event of a fire, if you're relying on copper landlines to deliver reverse 911 messages, they're likely to come down and those messages may not get delivered. And in our situation, they got delivered. However, they were delivered about a week afterwards when AT&T finally got the lines reinstalled. One thing to keep in mind is that this is going to be an emotional time. When you make these notifications, make them as quickly as you can, but make sure they're comprehensive, make sure they're accurate. And know ahead of time that no matter how fast you get that message out there, it's never going to be fast enough for some people. Just be prepared to deal with the emotional outpouring from your community. They're going to be looking for, as they go through the grieving process, they're going to be looking for somebody to be a sounding board, and oftentimes we in public services and the emergency services have to be that sounding board. Be prepared to deal with that. Be prepared to address it responsibly. Be prepared to address it professionally. During these events, monitor your social media. Have somebody out there with that messaging that if we send out reverse 911 messages over copper lines and we have ways of checking on them to see if they were delivered or not, if you have messages that say they weren't delivered or they're still trying, get that messaging out there ahead of time. Let people know, hey, as the landlines go back up, you might receive a message that was intended to be sent a couple days ago. Be aware that that might be coming, and it's not our fault that it got out a week late. It just happened as a result of the fire. Your PIO is going to be one of your most important people. Your PIO should work hand in hand with your incident commander. Your PIO should have no other duties other than being the PIO. That PIO should have somebody there to assist them to monitor social media. The amount of information that comes over social media is overwhelming, and it takes at least one person full-time just to monitor that, to see what needs to be separated and dealt with accordingly and what is just people venting publicly. A last suggestion that I would have is when you're monitoring social media, resist the urge to reply to everything that's out there. You're going to have thousands and thousands of people, depending on your jurisdiction, wanting answers and information. You're going to have a lot of them telling them how horrible of a job you did, and you're going to have some people that are going to be very supportive. Don't respond to everything. Try to designate what types of information is necessary to respond to. With that, as I started out, I feel kind of odd saying that these are the best practices. I'm just here to share what's worked best for us, and if there are any questions from the board, I'd be happy to respond.
Sheriff, I have a quick question. Your wireless emergency alerts, who makes those notifications in your jurisdiction?
Our wireless emergency alerts will go over through the iPOS system. Our vendor now is Code Red, and we are looking to transfer over to Nixle 360. Are you asking who the person is that creates those messages?
Yeah, who's the person who creates that?
As I said, we have pre-designated messages for certain events that we know may come, but anybody from the rank of sergeant up has the ability to access those messages. Our dispatch centers are able to do that under the direction of a sergeant or the dispatch managers as well. So we have multiple people designated with that authority and with that ability. What we want to avoid is the tendency for people to sit on information because they're concerned. My philosophy in my agency is that everybody that works for me is a public information officer. We're all public employees. We all have certain information, and it's my responsibility as the lead of the agency to make sure that they receive adequate training so that they know what is an appropriate message to send out and an appropriate manner and what is an appropriate time to do it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that perspective.
Well, I appreciate the comprehensive review, and you clearly use every tool in your toolkit. And as you pointed out, you're not a large organization, and you're not a large, well-resourced county, and your ability to do what you've done is just truly remarkable. And so we really appreciate your time here, and then having 2 major fire events to provide perspective on is makes you unusual, that you're able to see what you've done, what you changed, and what you used. And we do know that from this last event, you used just about every tool in the toolkit to get it out there, and so really remarkable. So
We do. I'm sorry. One more thing. When I want to touch on take the capabilities. One of the when we got the weather radios from NOAA, we did send a message out there, and we found out later on that everybody that had those weather radios, nobody received it, because we are such a rural area that we sit in the shadow of the broadcast. So we're also working with our federal partners to try to get some antennas up there to increase the availability of that. Rely on your communities. I think that's the best thing to do, is rely on your communities, push out messaging, engage your communities. As you mentioned, and as I mentioned, we are a very impoverished community, and our contracts are fully funded through donations from community groups such as the Rotary Clubs.
fantastic. Any other questions? Well, thank you, Sheriff. I really appreciate you taking the time to come to the board and present in this public forum your lessons learned. So thank you.
Thank you.
At this time, we'll be joined by Mr. Reggie Salvador, who is our Chief of Legislative and External Affairs here at Cal OS, and he's going to give us a legislative update to the board.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and just wanted to point out something for today that was announced as part of the governor's proposed budget, and that was the introduction, which I'm sure this board has been waiting for with a lot of eagerness, that the trailer bill language to restructure the SETNA fund. And the SETNA fund would be restructured from the current percentage rate to a flat fee structure that would capture both voice and data subscriptions for any device that will be able to access the 911 fund. Similar to the percentage structure, that monthly fee would be set annually, and the rate is proposed for what's currently posted on the Department of Finance website for between 10 to 60 cents could be also then lowered to no less than 5 cents and no greater than 50 cents. That way, it also sets the fund condition to simultaneously pay for both the legacy 911 system while simultaneously paying for the implementation of next generation 911. Also essential is that the funding model, similar to how it was originally created back in the 70s, the funding model will be able to be sustained for decades to come with enough flexibility to maintain both systems as well as the phase out and incoming of the next. Also, on the federal end, that the President on February 16th had signed H.R. 582, Carries Law Act of 2017, which amends the Communications Act, which requires multi-line telephone systems to have a configuration that permits users to directly initiate a call to 911 without dialing an additional digit code, prefix, or postfix. Lastly, I'd like to mention that today, after this 911 Advisory Board meeting, at 1 o'clock at the State Capitol in room 4202, the Assembly Communications and Conveyance Committee, in a joint hearing with the Joint Committee on Emergency Management, will be holding a hearing entitled Ready or Not, Emergency Communications Networks in the Face of Wildfires, Mudslides, and Public Safety Threats, which will be primarily focused not just on the December disasters. Ironically, the hearing was this hearing is part two of two hearings, which the first hearing was held on December 4th, looking specifically at emergency alert and warnings due to the October wildfires. That same night was the start of the Thomas Fire, which then also led into the January mudslide events in Montecito. So this hearing will discuss those events, but will also primarily look at FirstNet, such that both OES as well as FirstNet and AT&T will be testifying in front of the committees. So with that, I'll conclude with any questions. Thank you.
No. Okay, hey, thank you, Reggie. I appreciate your time today. I don't believe there's any public comment on those items that you have there, so thank you, Reggie, for that. Okay, moving on. We're going to go into our Next Gen 911 regional update. So Mr. Budge Courier, our branch manager for Cal OES, will provide that update to the public.
Tall people. Good morning. So the first thing we're going to discuss is something that we've been working with the Long Range Planning Committee on, and it's something we've mentioned to the board several times. We wanted to agendize it so that we could get some movement forward on it. As we roll out Next Gen 911, we have this regional model that you've seen several times, and we at the 911 branch see the need for regional working groups to help coordinate those efforts to make sure that what we do in the Next Gen space is in alignment with the operational needs of the PSAPs. And really the only way to do that is to make sure that we've got some working groups established so there's a feedback loop from what we're doing from a network perspective aligns with the needs of the PSAPs. So yesterday the Long Range Planning Committee met and they talked through this as an agenda item as well. And we really want to bring it before the board so we can figure out the governance structure that we want to put around that, whether it's just going to be informal and managed through the 911 branch, or if it would be a formal organization that reports up through the Long Range Planning Committee, or something that reports out directly to this board would essentially be the options. So I don't know if, Charlie, you want to give an update from the Long Range Planning Committee's perspective, but you know, we in the 911 branch, we recognize the need, and we're putting the need forward, and we're looking for input from the board on how best to meet that need.
Well, thanks, Budge. Yes, there was considerable discussion in the Long Range Planning Committee on how that would work, and I think the idea that the final idea that everybody seemed to agree on is that we would have regional committees based on the 4 EZNet areas that are being designated for the Next Gen deployment. Each of those committees would have a chair. They would report to Andrew at the state office. Andrew, are you here? Is that a surprise, or?
It's not a surprise
Not
for
a
him.
surprise. So, and then Andrew would put those, would report back to the LRPC, and the LRPC in turn would report back to the larger advisory board. Some of the ideas we had was to have those, you know, it could be done mostly through conference calls, but to have an in-person, maybe have the chairs of the 4 regions come to the 4 meetings of the advisory board and the LRPC meeting that precedes those. Clearly, there's, you know, vast differences in even within the EZNet regions. When you look at the Northern California region, you have the Bay Area with a very large population and very rural areas up in the northern part of the state, and a very vast geographic area. So we want to make sure that everybody's represented, and that all of the different PSAPs, regardless of size or geographic area, have a voice in how this is going to roll out, and the what goes well and lessons learned. So that at least was our preliminary idea, and we're happy to obviously take feedback from the full advisory board if anybody has other suggestions or a different model that they think might work.
Thank you. I think the feedback loop is certainly an appropriate mechanism. What was your thoughts on why, or were you looking? How are you looking to include the county coordinators into that as a potential option?
Well, hopefully there'll be county coordinators on every one of these regional committees, I would anticipate. And I know the state has a list of interested PSAP folks, and Budge, does that include county coordinators, or do we need to reach out to them as well to make sure they're included?
There are county coordinators on that list, yeah, and we could definitely make sure there's a representation from each region that includes county coordinators in that region.
So I was just trying to understand organizationally why you wouldn't just use your, some sort of rotating mechanism between your county coordinator to stand up your regional feedback loop, and then have that come back for your process to receive information from it.
Well, I think it's possible that a county coordinator could be the regional chair, but there's also very large PSAPs and PSAP managers that it might be more appropriate to head up the committee depending on the, time availability for some of the folks in each of those regions. So I think we want to give it some flexibility. It could well be a county coordinator, but it might be a PSAP manager or somebody else.
So at this point, if the structure we've suggested is good, then it would essentially be managed through the LRPC. I don't know if there's a need for action at the board. It would just be a task assigned to the LRPC. There might need to be a motion for that. I'm not sure. I'll defer to those who know more about this process. But that was really the point of getting it on the agenda, and we can certainly revisit this the next time we meet with a more thorough list of what we think those regional groups are, and then come up with a model, and then maybe we could task that with the LRPC to manage. And so we'll structure this again for the next time we meet. But in the meantime, we're looking for any feedback you might have, and we've been gathering this data from the PSAP communities as well.
Thanks, Budge. I think I definitely think it's a great idea to have that feedback from us. I would like to, if you could put together a kind of a short proposal, it doesn't have to be elaborate, but on how it would work and what the structure is and what your recommendation on the staffing would be. Come back to us. I don't know if it needs to be an addendum to the operations manual or not, or just an approval from the board so that we can post it and then make sure that everybody understands how we're going to look for it and what it'll be structured like. And it can be a minimum, maximum, and so you can kind of put that together, and that'll be fine.
I think we had talked about putting together a charter for these working groups, so that might be an appropriate way to describe it.
Much like the 911 work groups that we've had. And I think you could take the work we put into creating that and perhaps use it, if not just adjust it a little bit. That had, the intent of that group was to have representation from PSAPs large and small, rural and urban. So I think, unless you guys were looking for smaller groups, because that I think ended up with about 8 to 10 people on it. But if you're looking for groups that size, I think we could use almost the exact same thing that we had in the 911 work group.
And I also think that because the northern region and central region, for that matter, the majority of the counties are in their northern region has 31 counties and spans, many hours of driving, that maybe some subgroups are going to need to be put in place so that people have access. And someone in Susanville does have their voice heard, not because they're so far away.
I was just going to add that once you have your proposal together, we can take a look and see under what authority and if any formal action needs to be taken by the board to get that established.
Okay, perfect. All right. So the main purpose of that agenda item was we were having these conversations. We want to make sure the board was looped in so we could have a path forward. So we'll revisit this again next time. You'll see a more formal presentation on what we'll do moving forward.
But real quick on that, Bud, is that a standard agenda item for the board every time we meet, and LRPC will report back out on what took place that passed? Is that the plan?
Yeah, we'll include a recommendation on how the reporting structure will be, and then we'll have to, vet that and vote on it, and then include it as a standing agenda item. So yeah,
Right.
absolutely. That's a great idea. Okay, so I'll turn it back over to you, Mitch, because we're on the next item, which is me again, but all right. Okay. Thank you. So at this point, I'm going to give a branch update on some of the things that we've been working on since the last time that this board met. So you see a list of 8 items. I'm going to go through these one by one, and you have them in your slides. And please interrupt at any time if you have questions or feedback for me. So the first one is these might be the first time. Well, you've had your packages for a little while, but these are the updated call statistics from 2017. So we put them side by side with 2016, so you could have a comparison to see how the numbers changed. And you see that the overall call volume went from 28.5 to 28.1. The main reason why that call volume dropped is because the number of transfers is going down as the result of the wireless transfer project that we've been doing. And the fact that every single agency in California is now directly accepting wireless calls. So that's the main contributor to those numbers changing. You'll see that wireline is moving down slightly, and voice over IP is picking up that load. And so those are at about 15% and 4% now. And you see that our text went from about 5,000 in 2016 to 18,200. So of the overall call volume, it's not a significant statistic, but those 18,200 are extremely important for those whose only access to 911 is through that text because of the circumstances that they're in. So these are the call stats for 2017. And any questions on that before we move on? All right, so
Could
we
you
want.
explain to the public what telematics is?
So telematics would be your OnStars, the medic alert devices, or any other way to get into the 911 system that's not in one of those other buckets that's clearly defined there. All right, so the next agenda item is we've had a lot of discussion about call answer time and the state standards. So we sent out a letter to those PSAPs that were at 85% or lower in answering calls in 15 seconds. And so this chart that you see here was presented at the last board. There's no changes, but this is telling us what's causing these issues, what's causing the challenges in call answer times. So some is equipment related, but the vast majority is either staffing or the increased workload. Sometimes that means they're answering other types of calls that are not 911, and that's a big contributing factor. So we've been doing a lot of work in this space, and we've seen and been tracking the call answer time improvement using our call monitoring system that we have statewide. And of those 25 that got sent letters, 16 showed dramatic improvement in December and January, and 5 of them improved in one of those 2 months, and actually 2 of them met the standard. So the list is now 2 shorter overall. And so we're seeing them address these issues and move forward. In order to help facilitate this process, we've been reaching out to these PSAPs and helping them with best practices and things that they can implement. So you may remember the last time that this board met, I think it was 2 boards ago, we had Sacramento PD come in and talk about their call answer times. So this is really a success story, and what's on this slide are some of the actions that they took because they're one of the 2 PSAPs that are now fully compliant and are able to answer all their calls within the state standard. So not only did they get above the 85%, they're actually in the higher percentiles now, which is really good news. So at the time we sent the first letters, they were at about 82%, and now they're actually meeting the state standard of 95% in 15 seconds or less. Below here, you see that there's a really cooperative effort between not only the city council in taking action to get the tools and positions needed, but also on Chief Hahn, the chief of police, who put those practices in place to make this successful. So we took these types of success stories during our recent NENA board training event that we had last week. And we had a panel in one of the breakouts where we invited PSAPs up to discuss their success stories to meet their call answer times and some of the challenges that they were addressing. The session was about an hour and a half, and there was some members of the LRPC that helped facilitate that for us, and several PSAPs throughout the state participated in that board. And I know during the LRPC update, they're going to provide additional details on that. But we've been coordinating these efforts to help get these tools into the hands of the PSAPs so that they know how they can address these call answer times. So any questions on that?
Just a comment, Budge. I know, as you mentioned, we had the breakout session last week, but I think what this shows, the SAC PD success story, as well as even San Diego and some of the others, is just bringing it to the PSAP's attention, getting, or the department heads as well. And so I think I would certainly support continued efforts from the 911 branch, to keep doing that. I think the more people in a department that are aware of it, we can see what actual support for PSAP staffing can do to call answer time. So, thank you.
Budge, is there a discussion about increasing that and looking at everybody who's below the standard now?
So the next step is, yes, to start to refresh the list, because obviously call answer times change, over time as some of these best practices are implemented. So we're going to go take another look and refresh the list and do it again. We may wait until after June, July. We have a couple of irons in the fire that we need to negotiate first. I'm going to talk through some of them, and then we'll come back around to this. Yeah. So the next slide is a standing agenda item on our wireless technical routing analysis project. So these are the stats from the fourth quarter. And really, I would just focus you in on that bottom line across the bottom. There were 28,000 cell sectors that were analyzed, and of those, 15.69% were rerouted either from a PSAP to a different PSAP, from a PSAP to CHP, or from CHP to a PSAP. And that's really what this chart is talking about. Or from CHP to CHP, it's going to one CHP location, and it should be going to a different one. So this project is an ongoing cooperation between CHP. We definitely appreciate the resources that you're putting toward this to support us, as well as our office, and then working with the carriers. The next steps of this will be to ensure that the reroutes that were submitted were actually implemented. So at the next board, we'll have some statistics on that, because we're seeing a little lag in when our submissions are sent to the carriers and when they actually implement that wireless rerouting. The next slide is the statistics from last year. So it's a quarter by quarter breakdown of all the work that happened in 2017. 330,000 sectors were analyzed, and of those, about 11.3% were addressed for a reroute for one reason or another. So this is a tremendous amount of work that's gone into this, and we have another project in place to be able to track whether or not these reroutes were actually applied. Then you have to wait for them to be applied a certain amount of time. We'll give it a year. Then we pull the stats again to make sure that the reroute was effective, and we send it to the correct place. So this is an ongoing process, and you'll see we'll provide an update at the next board of where we are in 2018.
But a quick question on this. So just to make sure I understand, these stats here represent the recommendations as far as having a reroute done, but this doesn't mean the reroutes have been done.
That's exactly correct.
Okay.
These are the recommendations that we have submitted to the carriers. We are now going to start tracking if they applied those reroutes. And we're seeing some carriers are a little quicker at applying them than others. And you may remember last year we had this same discussion, and we actually had to encourage some of them to be a little more aggressive in their deployment schedules. We may have to do that again.
Because I recall last year there was some significant delays on getting those cutovers done. Do you have any indication, or is it too early to be able to say how well they're doing? Have they increased their performance, or are you still working on those stats?
We're still working on the stats, but our initial numbers indicate that they are not performing very well.
Okay.
So this next slide, we're probably going to take this off as an agenda item, if that's all right, because the good news is every agency in California is now directly accepting wireless calls. So this, I'm really happy to, put this stat up there on the board and remove it as a reporting item. All right, so thank you to everyone who helped us get this done. The next slide talks about our fiscal and operational reviews. These are the reviews that we do to work with the PSAPs to make sure, obviously, there's a compliancy piece to this to see what they're doing in relationship to what the 911 Operations Manual says and what the Warren Act requires the PSAP to do as well. And then we also look at their equipment, what they've got installed, validate that it matches what they should have installed, and then work them through some of the more technical aspects of their call answering equipment, their procurement, their replacement schedule, their training allotment, and all the other operational technical standards that they've got to meet. So our goal is to do at least 30 of these a quarter, and you can see that in the last quarter of last year we beat that. We were up to 38, and this quarter we will as well. We've already completed 17, and there's several scheduled throughout the month of March. So we'll be on track to continue this process. What we've been telling the PSAPs is we have a schedule and a rhythm established. However, if there's a PSAP who wants us to come sooner than later, let us know, and we'll move you up in the schedule. There may be some PSAP out there that needs some input from the 911 branch, and so we're willing to do that as soon as they let us know. So we have a pretty agile group of the 4 PSAP advisors that are doing this work. We're happy to go and meet with anybody that lets us know.
I don't know if everybody on the board has actually seen one of your fiscal and operational reviews. I was hoping that maybe in the next meeting you could bring some samples so they could actually take a look at one, so we can just pass it around so they actually know what one looks like and what the recipient actually receives back from you, Budge.
Okay, we can come up with an example for next board. All right, so this slide is a one-pager on our current contract status of those contracts essentially that are in a transitional phase. There are other contracts that we work with, but we wanted to highlight those where there's some ongoing effort. So the first one, there's a new foreign language vendor. Voyance is the name of that company. We expect to have a signed contract back from Department of General Services by mid-March, March 15th. If a PSAP wants to continue to use the state contract, essentially they do nothing and they'll be transitioned over. There are other options that are available to PSAPs for foreign language, and if you want to do something other than this, let us know, and your PSAP advisor can walk you through the different choices that are available. The next gen IFB, we have 2 of the regions are starting down this path, mainly because there was a contract that was expiring. We needed to transition those services over. And so these are the 2 that are listed here. One is in the Northeast and the other's in Pasadena. The Northeast one is pending a tariff process that has to be in place based on PUC guidance. And the second one is on schedule, but that date should actually be updated to July instead of April. The timelines are moving around a little bit on that one. The text to 911 IFB that we had out on the streets, we had to pull back that particular offer because of the tariff process, and it wasn't clearly articulated in the contract. And we're extending the current contract, and we expect that to be in place in March. The next gen 911 transition, I'm going to talk about that quite a bit, but the one major piece of news there is that next gen 911 services must be tariffed, and that's the guidance that the PUC has provided to us, and so we're working through that process right now. And I actually have a couple of slides on that later. So next gen. So this slide you've seen many times, and you see the puzzle pieces. We've been describing this as next gen is possible when all the puzzle pieces are connected. So you see 2 of them are not quite plugged in for a reason. Reggie talked about the work that's being done for the funding one, and there's some procurement work that's going on as well that I'm going to talk about in order to make this a reality. So before we get into that, there's been a lot of discussion, the differences of the various technologies that are out there. So I've presented on NextGen 911 to this board several times and provided a lot of detailed information. Essentially, NextGen is focused on taking the data or voice from those in need of emergency services through the NextGen 911 system and into the PSAP, where they can facilitate getting those services to where they need to be. That's the NextGen piece. It's bringing that information into the public safety answering point. The next piece of the puzzle is land mobile radio. So this is your mission critical voice system that you're using today and you've been using probably for quite some time. We've seen that this land mobile radio system is very reliable. It's the one thing that probably survives every disaster because it's designed to do that. And it will remain. And its primary purpose is voice communications between the dispatcher and those that are out in the field doing the emergency response. The other piece is FirstNet, or broadband services. So I put those as two separate titles because FirstNet is a specific solution for broadband services. So this is what's bringing the data from your CAD, in most cases, out to the emergency responder and interfacing with your mobile data computer or your mobile data terminal or whatever other interface you have for your emergency responder out in the field for data. That's where FirstNet is focused in. Now, obviously, there's a linkage that needs to happen to get the data into NextGen across to FirstNet and out to those in the field. And so all that is ongoing. The other piece, which ties into what the sheriff talked about, is the alert and warnings. So there's a local authority. Each local authority determines who that is. It could be dispatch personnel, it may not, that makes the decision to release the message. Once the message goes out, there's a variety of tools in that toolbox, and each tool has a specific purpose, and you need to know which one to use in which application. But it essentially is going a different path. It doesn't go back out over NextGen. It's not necessarily going over FirstNet, although it gets a little muddied because sometimes there's a shared tower where that might happen. But essentially, it's a different path back out. So the graphic is intended to show the relationship between the technologies and how they're independent, yet they work together. All right. So any questions on that?
Yeah, Butch, I think you pointed out the gap that exists right now, which is between the CPE and CAD, because it's a serial connection right now, and it needs to be an Ethernet connection in order to transfer data between the two networks. So I'm confident that'll be resolved at some point, but right now when you ask the CAD vendors, they say, well, it's the CPE vendors, and vice versa. So, I mean, that's sort of the critical gap that we have right now, because these are, two interdependent networks if we're going to truly be able to use the information both in the field and what we receive from the public. So,
right, and I agree, Charlie. So the approach we're taking is let's get NextGen defined, deployed, funded, procured, and then as we're deploying that, we can start to look at that piece, because right now it's really not even possible, right, to make that connection. Right, it's a serial connection. And then we'll take the next step. But that's something that we're going to have to discuss, as a 911 advisory board on what does that look like? What's appropriate to fund? What should be supported? How do we do that integration? How do we get the data from CPE over to CAD? And those are all important questions that we have to consider. Absolutely. Yep. We have some ideas. Okay, so moving through that, this regional map has not changed since we talked last time, but this would, align directly with those regional groups that are made up of the PSAPs in that region. And so this is our deployment model moving forward, and the prime network serves a variety of functions, but essentially it's there to route the call in case any region is incapable of doing that, so we don't suffer an outage. Even if you build a system to 4 or 5 nines, there's still several minutes or longer of downtime that are, included in a 4 or 5 9 solution if 99.99% reliability. So we're building this network so that if it does go down, we have the ability to back ourselves up, and that's one of the purposes of the prime. It's also going to be the data master for the location information. It'll provide a single point to route all text to 911. and any other newer technologies that would be a little difficult to implement, maybe in a particular region. So we've got some detailed plans out on how this would work, and I'm going to walk through a couple more slides to address those. This is our update on how we're providing guidance on the tariffs. So we've taken this tariff idea. December 19th, we met with all the vendors. We published some tariff guidance 2 weeks ago. We've met back with all the vendors to discuss the tariff guidance document that we put out. And we broke the tariffs up into buckets that are essentially in alignment with the major parts of the network. So we have this aggregation service. So you can imagine all the calls are coming in to the network, and that's call aggregation. They're coming in from the originating service providers on the left-hand side of this diagram. And then they'll be aggregated, and the decision will be made. Is my regional network alive? Okay, send it there, and it'll route the call. If it's not, send it to the prime, and the prime will handle it for you. Then there's these core services that are associated with each of the regions. And then there's the interconnections all through the network that we're calling Next-Gen 911 trunks. And then in addition to what's not really shown on here is there's some transitional services that we need to account for as we go from legacy over into the next-gen world. So we're structuring the tariff model around, this kind of high-level diagram. Oh, I just skipped one. All right, so as I said, the two pieces of the puzzle that are not plugged in yet are funding and procurement. This slide speaks to the procurement. One thing to remember is our existing 911 system is procured through tariff today, majority of it. I'd say 80 to 90% is all tariff today. That's the world we're in. It's the world we've been in for a long time. So this PUC guidance keeps us in that same paradigm. It keeps us in that same space, and they have to be tariffed. As I've said, we've identified these 4 major areas. We've put out this guidance document. It was sent out to you on the board, and it's available on our website as well, to try and define these major buckets that the tariff services need to be defined for. And now we're working through the additional details of how we actually select a vendor to provide those services, and we've been having some long conversations about that. The fact that the services have to be tariffed pushed our timeline out a little bit and may push it out even farther because we can't move forward until the tariffs are in place. These are, as in the office, they call it a budge timeline. It's somewhat optimistic and aggressive. And so originally these dates that you see in red were June, July timeframe. We're pushing them out into the fall. Our goal is to not change the last bullet on the slide. We want to make sure we decommission the legacy network by 2022. That's the goal. So if we have to push the beginning of the project out a little bit, we don't want to extend it any longer. But again, those red dates are subject to established tariffs, which are essentially outside of our direct control for that process. This slide hasn't changed. I've kept it in here because the cost model is important to keep in mind. Again, upper left is steady state today. Bottom right is steady state after next-gen is deployed. And as you roll out next-gen, you move some legacy costs go away and some next-gen costs come in play. And so that's what this graphic is showing. That bottom number in legacy is essentially everything CPE related and all the other operational costs that are independent of the network that delivers the call to the PSAP. And that's where that number comes from. So a little more on funding. This is an updated set in a graph. You can see for the first time since I've been briefing, the chart is going up. And that's all contingent upon a successful governor's budget going through and the funding model being shored up. So there's a big caveat there in the orange portion of the graph that's contingent upon success of our proposed plans that are out there right now. So if you want to see the numbers behind that, what we're showing is a fund balance, which is not a very comfortable balance, because if you think about it, this is a month and a half of operating budget that we have in reserve at any given time. We'd like that number to be significantly higher, but the long-term funding plan will shore that up. The good news is it's not in the red. That's the big takeaway for this slide. Any questions on that before we move on? So the funding plan, Reggie spoke to this. It's basically a two-step process. The first step is to get a one-time inject, hopefully, of funding from general fund to shore up the difference in what we're projecting for fiscal year 2018-2019, and then long-term sustainability happens through the trailer bill language that will restructure the Setna model to bring in not only what we need for legacy 911, but also to sustain next-gen 911 as well. And we're trying to, the goal is to be as wise as they were the first time around when the funding model was established and was good for 40 years. We'd like to do the same thing. So we're removing any technology-specific language and reliance on anything intra-state voice. And we're also relying on data that's currently available. We don't want an additional burden on anyone that's providing the data. And we're looking at a surcharge for all subscriptions that can access 911.
Budge, I have a quick question on reference to this Setna portion of it. As we've discussed before, the Chiefs Association is very involved with trying to get this matter corrected, obviously. So my question to you and to maybe even Reggie would be, what can the Chiefs Association or members of this board do to further this request and the trailer bill forward by reaching out to any representatives that may necessary?
Here you go, Reggie.
We're continuing to work with both industry as well as legislative leadership. While there are meetings that are ongoing, perhaps it's best that your organizations can continue to communicate the support for the needs, if you will, and perhaps even maybe coordinating with not just the police chiefs, but with the sheriffs, with the fire chiefs, with public safety groups in general, for whether it's sending support letters or even developing a coalition movement, if you will. So,
Do we currently have a sponsor for the legislation?
As a trailer bill, it's probably going to be done through budget committee.
All right. Any other questions on that?
Budge, can I have a quick question on the procurement? With the different EZNets, are those going out for procurement independently, or is it going to be a package, or do we know?
So at this point, we don't know. We're trying to work through the details of, in the tariff world, there's a very clear process to define the service and how you establish that. But what's lacking is the ordering process and kind of what you would typically see in a contract world. So we're working very closely with our legal team and with our procurement folks and also with CPUC to make sure that we define that properly. So the next time we meet, I'll have a lot more data on that. But we just don't have anything in writing yet.
Okay, because the reason I asked the question is, you know, you look at the system and how all the EZNets work together. If one goes down, obviously calls are moved and everything else, and just trying to figure out if having multiple vendors will create problems as far as the system actually working as it should. Because I know sometimes you end up with incompatibility issues with technology. And I think it's important we make sure that our overall system works really, really well and seamless given what it does.
Yeah, and so that's part of the effort that I've been really working on. I've been working with other states. As a 911 administrator, I'm part of the National Association of State 911 Administrators, and there are a couple other states who are successfully doing this today, Indiana being one of them. And so I've been talking to their leadership to see They have 2 ESI nets in Indiana, and their goal is very similar to ours. I've also been talking to Texas, and Texas wants to deploy a similar model. So everyone agrees that the need is there because there's going to be multiple vendors in this space. So we have to solve the problem. So we're taking a leadership role and trying to move this forward and provide a way to facilitate not only through the contract vehicle but through the services, and relying on the NENA I3 standard to be able to do this. So because it has to be done. Even if we had a single vendor, you still would need to transfer to another state where it's a different vendor. And so everyone agrees the need is there, and no one yet has been willing, with the exception of Indiana, to really step up and say, let's fix this. So we've raised our hands, and we're gonna play a lead role in this. Yep. So this last bullet, I think, Chief Peters, goes to your point. But if this plan is approved, we've got the funding we needed to sustain 911 today, and also to build out next gen, and we've got a stable funding model moving forward. That's the goal. So some things you can do to help. Obviously, if you have questions, contact us. We can help fill in some of the gaps. Whatever we know, then we can share. The other thing, and this goes to, I was recently in Washington, D.C. for the 911 Goes to Washington event. It was the 50th anniversary of the first 911 call on February 16th, 1968. I didn't make that call. I might have caused it, but I didn't make it. So what we've seen in working with these national organizations is there's tremendous value if you invite your representative into your center and tell them what you do. Help them understand why this is important, and invite them into your center. Whether that's your state senator, state representative, or your U.S. Congress, person, invite them in, or your U.S. senator, and help them understand what happens in the PSAP and why this is important. And so we can give you some tools and information to facilitate that conversation. We think that's a really important part, that they understand why this is important and what the advantages are going to be, and how they can support. It's a lot more difficult for them to take a hands-off approach if they've been in your center and heard your voice directly. So I think that would really be a key time. And you really have time over the next few months to do that before probably any votes happen. And so if you need some assistance on that, let us know. We can certainly do that. And then, as Reggie said, this coalition idea of working through your associations and organizations. And if you want us to come talk, we can share whatever we're allowed to share and help facilitate the exchange of information. We're certainly willing to work with you in that regard.
Budge, that would be very helpful. I think that information, we could disseminate it throughout our organizations. Also, if there's any hearings on the budget matter, if the office could put out those dates in advance so that we could get people to be present there and to represent, that would be another benefit for us.
Okay. I look to Reggie, so hopefully he's got that for action.
Additionally, if we could just put the committee group so that if we can't make it, we can send a letter of support, that'd be.
Okay. All right, any other questions on this? This might be my last one. All right, any other questions for me?
Yeah, Budge, real quick on, I hate to go back to slide 14, but just as an overview, on the 85% calls not answered within the 15 seconds, it appears that the equipment-related piece is only a very small portion, about 21%. But if you look at the lack of staffing and the increased workload, they pick up the lion's share of that. And it's more of a statement, maybe I don't know how to move forward, but it seems that when we identify somebody that's not making the standard, that we contact them with a letter and then give them the opportunity and the tools to improve. So I'd like to, if there's a possibility we could be more proactive than reactive, I think that would be helpful, because there's probably PSAPs that are, as you redo these numbers, you're going to find there's people that are going to jump up on the list and jump off. But also if a PSAP is struggling even a little bit and they could benefit from some of those best practices that you've been sending out, I think it might not be a bad idea to be a little more proactive on that rather than reactive.
Right, and to that point, I talked with Charlie during that breakout session at NENA. There was a lot of good information that was shared, and not everyone could be in attendance. So we want to draft up kind of a best practices laundry list of things that you can implement. And, you know, not every PSAP is the same. We understand that. What might work in PSAP A may not work at all in PSAP B. But having the data available of some things to, you know, that have been proven successful, and then a resource both at the state and through the LRPC reaching back to PSAPs who have done it so that you can talk to someone of similar size. Those are the tools we're going to put in place to be more proactive, and we'll share that data with the PSAPs when we're out doing our fiscal and operational review and anyone who shows up on that list. So that's some of the things we're doing to try and be more proactive in this space.
And rather than, I don't know what that would take, but is there a way that we could just relay that information to all the PSAPs just as a more of an informational piece?
Absolutely. Once the document's drafted, we can send it out to everyone, and we have the ability to do that. They don't all open it, but we can certainly send it.
We do our best.
Yes.
I do want to compliment you on the fiscal and operational reviews. That gives them, everybody a good assessment, and gives them some feedback as to how they're doing, which, you know, is not always present there. And then the tools that you've been putting out electronically, like on the ECAT side of the household, those managers have been able to isolate where they're having challenges on their call taking. And so I think that's been substantial to be able to go back and look by shift and by day, and not just looking at an aggregate number where they were before. So I really am grateful that that tool is working as well as it is for your folks out there. And I'm sure there's some folks that are not as well trained on how to use the tool, and so we just need to make sure that we're continuing to provide those educational services so that everybody else can officially, you know, use the ECATs properly to give them the tools they need to make those management decisions.
And the staffing module tool is available to every PSAP, and it helps give an indication of how many call takers should be on duty. And that's been very favorably received throughout the PSAPs. Some are using it for all their predictive staffing in the center. And so we had breakout sessions on that at NENA as well. And there's a lot of data and information available on that as another tool to help understand. It even goes so far as to say, okay, I know this major holiday's coming up. This is typically what the load has been, and it's coming again. This is a known event in my community. What's the staffing level needed for that particular event? It doesn't talk to dispatch. It's just call taking, so you really have to help people understand that. But once you understand that's what the tool is for, it can be very effective for planning, and I know there's several on the board that are using that today. All right.
Thank you, Budge. I really appreciate your update. That was a lot of information that went out there, and certainly the most comprehensive portion from it. From that, we'll move into the Long Range Planning Committee update.
Thanks, Mitch. We discussed the the regional work groups during Budge's presentation, so I won't rehash that. But to talk a little bit about the call answering time workshop that we did at NENA, and my colleague Chris Herron was on that panel as well, so I'll welcome him to chime in any time here. We also had representatives from Orange County and SHASCOM, and Alicia Fuller from the state, who really coordinated everything and did a great job in getting the presentation into slide format and to gather all the information from the various PSAPs. And a number of things came up without going into the full detail, because I think we are going to put together a white paper or some kind of an informational which talks about best practices and how to be compliant with the state standard. Some of the things that came up is just measuring your call answering time, or being aware of what it is. Just by having that data seems to improve performance, and also letting your dispatch team know, your call takers, where you do, what your call answering times are. That alone helps improve data. That being said, as the chief pointed out, staffing is one of the major issues, and it is virtually every center in the state has issues with staffing. Very low unemployment in the state right now. A lot of options and jobs out there. Call taking and dispatching is a difficult profession that not a high percentage of the population can actually do. So even when you test, train, and put people into a training program, if 2 out of 3 folks make it through training, most PSAP managers would agree that's a that's a high success rate. We talked about all the ancillary calls that come into the PSAPs. Their primary mission is to answer 911 calls and dispatch the appropriate emergency response. But PSAPs and communication centers become a dumping ground for other departments and agencies that after hours, weekends, when they go to lunch, and being able to control that and push back on those calls, because even if you're prioritizing 911 calls, you still have to put that call on hold, pick up the 911 call, and that when we talk to our colleagues at Orange County and Shascom, by eliminating some of those calls, that improved their call answering time significantly. There's ways you can adjust your ACD. The ECATS information is very helpful, and we'll come out with a much more detailed synopsis of best practices from that work session. And Chris, anything you'd like to add?
Well, of course. No, I think you have covered the topics that we discussed. It was a really good session, but again, Budge's point, we had 30 or 40 people there, so we need to find a way to reach out to everyone, and I think putting together that best practices document sounds like a really good start. And really, the point there is letting people know there are resources out there. We've seen the success stories. If you use the tools available, you can have a dramatic effect on your 911 answer time. So it's a good movement. We'll keep pushing forward.
And I guess one last point is it seems like it's bad publicity to be on that list or to have that come out in the press. But in the reality, it has enabled some agencies to get additional staffing. I think San Diego Sheriff and Sacramento both got additional call takers based on the information that came out from the state office and eventually made it into the press. Now, certainly you want to be able to show improvement after those numbers come out, but it's not necessarily a bad thing if you've been fighting for staffing for years and never been able to get it, that those stats come out.
Great feedback, and I agree. We're promoting this. We want to solve one piece of the process at a time, and the call taking is our focus here, and that's what we're going to keep working on. So I think the ideas that you presented on a best practices letter, and we'll get it out through all of our forums, would be certainly helpful to saturate. So thank you very much. I appreciate the back brief, Charlie, and Chris, thank you. All right, moving into our county coordinator task force update is Ms. Kessler. There she is. Hi, Tracy.
Good morning. I'm going to give you the text to 911 deployment stats. Deployed PSAPs, we have 158 deployed. 61 have selected their TCC. And if you can go to the next slide. Out of the 447 PSAPs response, there was 356, 118 were deployed. Deployed by February is 47, by June is 19, by December will be 128, and still developing their deployment plan are 19 PSAPs. So those are the stats for that. Just wanted to let you know that statistics are showing that the impact of agencies is about 1% or less for text to 911 over voice calls. So the impact is not overwhelming to PSAPs, so that's a good thing. They're also reporting a very manageable and smooth deployment, so it's all good news so far. That's a good thing. I wanted to share with you that other states are also looking at California as a model. We've had PSAPs from Phoenix, Arizona area come to California PSAPs to take a look at how we've deployed, looking at best practices, lessons learned, and just getting an overall feel. We've also had preliminary talks from PSAPs in Texas to do the same thing. So we're looking good so far. As for the county coordinator, we will be having a forum April 5th, and the intent of that forum is to go over, Cal OES is developing a new automated wireless program to do the routing and track the routing better. So there was a Cal NENA breakout where Alicia Fuller showed the county coordinators the preliminary program. It's still in development. The forum shall show us some more and ask for input so that all the county coordinators can give their input so we can build the best system possible. And that's it, unless you have questions.
I do have a question, Tracy, on
Sure.
on the text to 911. Has there been any discussion amongst the county coordinators about whether the 2 licenses allotted to each PSAP is enough? Have PSAPs expressed a concern yet that you've heard?
Nobody
No?
has expressed a concern with or a problem with that at all.
Okay, thanks.
Is there anything that the board needs to do to support you differently on this rollout and as you're continuing to move? And you certainly may be distributing the new best practices guide to all the county coordinators as well based on that development that was just going on in the previous discussion. But I wanted to follow up on the tech side of the house, if there's anything else that you needed from us.
No, I think we're doing really good. So I think everything is going really well right now, and I don't think we need anything.
Tracy, do you know how many of the PSAPs have implemented the integrated solution as opposed to the separate web-based solution?
I do not know, but I can find that out by the next time and
Great,
report on
thanks.
that.
That would be interesting to know.
Yeah.
Tracy, a quick question for you. In the numbers that we have from 16 to 17, it looks like it's gone 3 times more text from 16 to 17, and you're kind of indicating that it's not been a big impact. Do you anticipate at some point there's a tipping point, or we'll have to wait and see?
My personal opinion is once it stays out in the media and everybody knows about it, yeah, there will be, people will start using it more, but in an emergency situation, people really do want that calming voice on the other side telling them what to do. Yeah. So I do believe that it will only be in cases where you can't talk.
Okay.
So I do think that the majority will stay voice, just for that calming voice and some direction on what to do. Text takes longer. You don't have that person on the other end reassuring you. So.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, great questions. Call if you can and text if you can't.
Correct.
All right. Thank you very much,
Okay,
Ms. Kessler.
thank
I
you.
appreciate the update. Okay, our next agenda item is just an update. Our next scheduled meeting for us is June 7th. And I don't know, I wanted to open it up now to make sure if the board had any items that they're aware of that they want to wish added to that meeting. There was a couple of questions that came out already that have been flushed, but if this is an opportunity, if there's anything else that you would like to see added to the next board meeting, you can do so at this time. Hearing none, then we'll go into public comment. This time we'll take public comment, and if anyone would like to come up to the microphone on the podium, please state your name and keep your comments under 3 minutes. We look forward to hearing from you. Well, that was easy. Okay. If there's no further business and there's no objection, this meeting will be adjourned. Move to adjourn?
I can't move.
Do we have a move to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Second? All right. We're adjourned. Thank you.